Time is a lot of the things that people say God is. There's the pre-existing and having no end. There's the notion of being all-powerful, because nothing can stand against time, not mountains, not armies. Give anything enough time and everything is taken care of. All pain encompassed, all hardship erased, all loss subsumed. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Remember, man, thou art dust, and unto dust thou shalt return. And if time is anything akin to God, I suppose that memory must be the devil.
I suppose that memory must be the devil. A strange sentence, isn't it? But actually, I think it is really engaging idea, and if you think about it closely, it becomes mind-blowing, or at least it opens up a surprisingly deep philosophical problem. Because what would it even mean to say that time is akin to God? Or, more radically, what if God is time itself? Usually when we talk about God and time, we ask a very different question. We ask whether God created time, and then we get into this familiar philosophical problem. If God created the universe, and time is part of the universe, then presumably God created time as well. But then we ask, what was God doing before time existed? And immediately we have a problem. Because the word before already assumes time. You cannot really say before time without using the very thing you are claiming did not yet exist. This is why many theological and philosophical discussions have argued that God cannot be contained within time in the way that we are. We live within time. We move from the past through the present towards the future. But God, if God is eternal, is supposed to be outside this succession. So the question becomes, what does it even mean for an eternal being to create time? And this is where things become interesting, because perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, did God create time? What happens if we ask, is God time? Now that sounds almost absurd, to be fair, but it is not a completely new question. The relationship between God, eternity, and time goes back thousands of years. The Greeks were already struggling with the nature of time. Aristotle famously asked what time actually is. Is it movement? It is something associated with movement. Is it the measurement of change? And later philosophical and theological traditions inherited this problem and developed it in different directions. But there are also ancient thinkers who came much closer to treating time itself in a divine or cosmic way. One particularly interesting example is Proclus, the 5th century Neoplatonist. In his theology of Plato, Proclus discusses time in relation to divine reality and gives time a distinctly divine and demiurgic character. He even speaks of time in a way that places it within the hierarchy of divine beings. And this is where the question becomes even more interesting. What would actually happen if we took the statement, God is time, seriously? Not merely metaphorically, but philosophically. Because if we do that, something strange happens. We may suddenly have a completely different way of thinking about the existence of God. Think about it. One of the traditional problems in philosophy of religion is, why does anything exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? And when we try to explain existence, we often eventually arrive at some kind of necessary reality, something that does not depend upon something else for its existence. For classical theism, that necessary reality is God. But if God is outside time, another problem immediately appears. How does a timeless God produce something temporal? How does an eternal reality produce a universe in which things begin, change, and end? And this is where Aristotle becomes particularly important. Aristotle does not think of time as something that simply began with the universe in the straightforward way we might imagine. His understanding of time is closely connected to motion and change, and because he thinks the cosmos is eternal, time is also in a sense eternal. There is no first moment of time, there is no absolute temporal beginning, and this has created enormous problems and opportunities for later philosophers, because if time is eternal, then the universe does not have a temporal beginning. And yet Aristotle still wants a first principle, cause of motion, an eternal actuality. So something that explains the order of reality without itself being merely another changing thing within that order. Later Christian and Islamic philosophers inherited these problems and spent centuries trying to reconcile Aristotle with doctrines of creation. And this is important because the scholastics generally did not simply say God is time. They spent enormous amounts of effort distinguishing God from time. Some accepted aspects of Aristotle's account, some rejected others, some tried to reconcile Aristotle with creation, and some developed completely new accounts of eternity. But what interests me is not whether the medieval theologians eventually accepted the statement. What interests me is what happens if we go one step further. Suppose that time isn't merely something God created. Suppose time isn't merely something God knows. Suppose time isn't merely the framework in which creation happens. Suppose God is time. Then something very strange follows, because everything we experience happens through time. Everything that we remember happened in time. Everything we imagine happens in some imagined time. Every possibility we can conceive seems to have some relation to time. Even when we imagine a world without time, we are imagining it from within time. So perhaps time is not merely one feature of reality. Perhaps time is the condition through which reality becomes intelligible to us at all. And if that is true, then saying God is time begins to sound less like an absurd sentence and more like a metaphysical hypothesis. But then we immediately encounter another problem. And this is where the movie clip I showed you becomes interesting, because if God is time, where does memory go? Memory is strange. Memory allows the past to remain present. Something happened yesterday. Yesterday no longer exists. And yet somehow yesterday exists inside us. I can remember something that happened 10 years ago. The event itself is gone. The moment has disappeared into the past. But the memory remains. And this is perhaps what makes the opening statement so interesting. I suppose that memory must be the devil, because memory seems to resist time. Time takes everything away from us. Everything moves. Everything changes. Everything that happens becomes past. But memory somehow pulls the past back into the present. And perhaps this is why memory has always had such a strange position in philosophy. Augustine, for example, spends an extraordinary amount of time thinking about memory. In the Confessions, he asks what memory actually is. And when he looks inward, he finds something almost impossible to describe. The past is no longer physically present, and yet it somehow exists within us. So what exactly is memory? Is it the past? Obviously not. The past has already passed. Is it the present? Not exactly. Because I can remember something that is no longer happening. So memory creates this strange relationship between what has happened and what is happening now. It brings the past into the present, and that makes the question of God and time even stranger. Because if God is time, then what is the relationship between God and memory? Is memory somehow outside time? Can we say that? Or is memory simply another function of time? Or perhaps memory is precisely what allows us to experience time as time. Because without memory, would we even experience time? Imagine waking up every second with absolutely no memory of the previous second. There would be no continuous self. There would be no meaningful past. There would only be an endless succession of disconnected moments. So perhaps memory is not something added to our experience of time. Perhaps memory is part of what makes our experience of time possible. And then the question becomes even more uncomfortable. If God is time and memory gives us access to the past, then what exactly is the relationship between God and the past? Does the past still exist? If it does, where? And if it doesn't, what exactly is memory remembering? We usually speak about the past as though it were somewhere, but where is it? The past is not behind us in a physical location. The future is not somewhere in front of us waiting to arrive, and the present itself is incredibly difficult to define. The moment I try to point towards now, that moment has already passed. So what exactly is time? We have been asking this question for thousands of years, and despite all the progress we have made in physics and philosophy, the basic question remains strangely difficult. What is time in reality? Not how we measure it, not what a clock tells us, but what is it? Is it something that exists independently? Is it a relation between events? Is it change, as what some of the Neoplatonists described? Is it an ordering of events? Is it the past real? Is the past real? Is the future real? Does only the present exist? And if only the present exists, then what exactly are we remembering when we remember the past? These are not merely abstract questions that I'm asking today, they completely change the way we think about God. Because if God is timeless, then God stands outside this succession of movements. But if God is time, then God is somehow present in the succession itself. And then we have another question. If God is time, what happens to possibility? Are all possible events already contained within God? Or are possibilities somehow outside God? Think about all the things that could happen tomorrow. Some of them will happen, some will not. But before tomorrow arrives, all these possibilities seem to exist in some sense. So where are these possibilities? Are they inside time? Are they outside time? Are they in the mind? Are they in God? And if God is time, does that mean that every possible future is somehow already contained within God? If so, what does that do to free will? What does it do to creation? What does it do to God's knowledge? And perhaps most importantly, here we have to ask, what does it do to God himself? Because the traditional idea of God is usually that God is the foundation of reality. God is not merely one thing among other things. God is supposed to be the reason that everything exists at all. But if God is time, then we have to ask whether time itself possesses the characteristics traditionally attributed to God. Is time necessary? Is time eternal? Is time independent? Does time contain everything that happens? Does time make existence possible? And if the answer to some of these questions is yes, then perhaps the phrase God is time is not as meaningless as it first sounds. But there is another question, and I know I'm asking so many questions, but if God is time, then what happens to everything we normally associate with God? Time seems impersonal. We pray to God, we worship God, we ask God for things, but time does not seem to answer us. Time does not seem to choose. Time does not seem to have intentions. Time simply is. And yet perhaps this is precisely where the question becomes interesting. Because maybe we have become so accustomed to thinking about God as a person that we have forgotten that some of the oldest philosophical ideas about the divine were not necessarily about a person sitting somewhere in the universe. They were about the ultimate structure of reality, the principle behind existence, the eternal, the unchanging, the thing through which everything else becomes possible. And if we take time seriously enough, perhaps time begins to look strangely similar to some of these descriptions. Time contains everything that happens. Everything we experience happens within time. Everything that comes into existence does so at a particular moment. Everything that disappears becomes part of the past. And everything that we call the future eventually becomes the past. But before past, it becomes present. So perhaps the question isn't as simple as asking whether God created time. Perhaps we should ask, what if time itself is one of the ways we understand the divine? Or even more radically, what if what we call God is what we experience as time? I don't know if that is true, and honestly, I don't think the interesting part is reaching a conclusion too quickly. The interesting part is what the question does to everything else. It makes us think eternity, it makes us think creation, it makes us think existence, our existence. It makes us rethink the past and the future. And perhaps most strangely of all, it makes us rethink memory. Because we live inside time, we remember what has disappeared, we imagine what has not yet happened, and somehow between these two things we construct this strange thing we called the present. But the present itself is almost impossible to hold. The moment you try to grasp it, it has already become the past. And yet we remember it, we carry it within us. Something that no longer exists can somehow continue to exist inside the mind. And perhaps this is why that sentence, I suppose that memory must be the devil, is so fascinating. Because if time is what takes everything away from us, then memory is what refuses to let everything disappear. Time moves forward, memory looks backwards. Time makes the past unreachable, memory brings the past back. And perhaps that is why memory feels almost like a rebellion against time itself. So if God is time, then perhaps the deepest mystery isn't simply where God came from, or whether God created the universe, or even what God was doing before time. Perhaps the deeper question is, what is this thing we call time? And why, within this endless movement of existence, are we given the strange ability to remember what has already disappeared? Maybe we will never fully answer that, but perhaps that is exactly why we keep asking. For thousands of years, philosophers have asked what time really is, and thousands of years later, we are still here, inside it, moving through it, trying to understand it, and remembering everything that it takes away.